Hey guys, our decline here, average picker. So this video is for an engineering student who posted on the subreddit about looking for a project with making a nearly unpickable lock. And specifically he was asking about like how many pins basically would it take to make a lock nearly unpickable. And I gave kind of a smart ass answer, and now I'm feeling a little bad because he actually is looking for some info. And so I thought I would do this little video to touch on things. Also though, I will point out I have taken a little bit of a note from Albert LaBelle. He's got this cool little wall with people's names on it who have been supportive or inspired him, whatever. And so I did a foiled by piece of cardboard. So I think I got everybody that has foiled me at least one time. I don't know. If you think I missed you and your name deserves to be on the foiled wall, let me know, and eventually I will end up with a bigger piece of cardboard. So, yeah, anyway, on to the question. We'll just have a beer here and think about this. The number of pins. I mean, I jokingly said 101, and the reason being that 101 pins would extend a lock out. You know, I mean, if that's only 5 on this one, you know, the lock's going to be out to here. And I've touched on this in other videos and stuff before, especially with challenge locks. But a lock is basically, you're kind of looking at this balance of, you know, usability and durability and reliability. You know, and you can't have a lock that's that long. That just, nobody's going to want to use that. No one's going to want to carry a key around that long. It doesn't make sense. Similarly, yeah, I've said before, I think if you just tripled all the springs in a lock, you know, they would be under so much tension. But the problem is the key, from a user perspective, the key is not going to slide in and out of there very smoothly because you're going to be fighting those springs just the same as you would with a pick. But that said, there is something to that. So, as smartass as it was, one is just having an understanding of what tools pickers use. Because the tools are designed for the locks, and if you can break away from your average tool, as we saw with like the Boley lock, where you have to make custom tools, you're going to start to run into pickability problems on average. So, you know, a lot of your picks are like that. A lot of them tend to taper up and get a little bigger here, so the more you're forcing somebody to put more of the pick in, the more chance that they're going to end up lifting pins on one of these thicker parts of the shank. Similarly, if the lock is just long enough, the pick's just not going to fit. But again, for practical use purposes, it's not very practical. And it's the same thing with like the triple spring stuff. Overall, I would say you just cannot beat precision. I mean, even with just standard, well, just good, precise, standard pins and just really good tolerance lock, you know, you end up with something like this. This is an ASA. I don't know exactly which one. People have told me before, and I kind of forgot. I mean, this is just this is a tough lock. I mean, it just is. I'm not saying it's unpickable, but it's only 5 pins, and it's just well put together, and that makes it way more difficult to pick than something else like this guy, who also has 5 pins, and about 4 of them are spools. But it's incredibly easy to get through. Standard pins, same number, just better tolerance. Incredibly hard, more difficult. Likewise, you get up into, you know, the Schlage, and this is where I think you start to get into a couple little gimmicks sometimes, because the Schlage has that check pin on the side. So if you know, slide something in and can just pop that check pin up, you know, you can just pick it as a standard 6. But the tolerances on the Everest are, again, better than on just one of their run-of-the-mill ones. So even an Everest, if you know about the little gimmick in there, You know, even if you got the same number of pins and this one has spools in it, this is still a tougher lock. And there's a lot of other gimmicks people have done, putting little like buttons in the back that the tip of the key ends up running into. So if you don't know that that button is there, to go back and depress that at some point in the picking process, you know, that's going to make the lock a lot tougher. So, you know, I can't say, oh, you need X number of pins. Now, 6 pins generally is more difficult than 5 pins. I don't think I've ever picked a 7-pin lock, and I know there are some out there. I don't know how much more it adds to it. 5 to 6 is pretty much what you run into standard. Is more, I guess, more common out there. 6 to me is the slight sweet spot, because you can still size it with 6, fairly normal and regular. And 6 really does add an extra element that can be difficult to get through. Sorry for the little pause there. Just collecting a few thoughts. I think somebody else mentioned in the thread keyways, more restrictive keyways. So if we look at something like this, that is a more restrictive keyway than, say, again, back to our ASA, which isn't all that bad. In fact, the ASA's big enough, I mean, you can just pick from the very bottom here, where this lock, you tend to need to get on that little ledge. I should maybe flip the camera around for this. Let's do that. Okay, so we still got Albert LaBelle's challenge lock here in the background. So talking about keyways, so this is kind of a more restrictive keyway than this. I mean, this you can come in and you can pick straight in. Generally speaking, people like to say that your more restricted keyway, see how, I don't know if you can see me trying to get up the same pick on that first pin. There we go. You got to come right in there. They tend to say the more restrictive keyway makes a lock more difficult, and that is true to a point. This lock is still substantially easier than this ASA, and it comes down to tolerances. I've got a couple picks that are in 20 thousandths, and they will just fit right down in through that gap really nicely. They're rounded. It's rounded. Let me show you one of them, since I'm guessing you haven't seen a lot of tools. So a pick like this, not a lot of lift on it, but it doesn't need a lot of lift, and it fits very nicely right down through there and just pops them all into place and opens it probably, you know, I don't know, in less than a minute, if I'm really on my game, I guess. If I had to go out and give you a time it was going to take me. But so again, less restrictive keyway, better tolerance is much more difficult. The other thing that sometimes happens, I don't know if I have a good example here. I was kind of glancing around to see if I did. Look real quick again. Some of these, you'll just have to use your imagination. Some of these restrictive keyways, the pin ends up sitting much higher up in the warding. So the keyway itself may be a standard or bigger size, but the pins are actually sitting up fairly recessed up in there. And it means the pins end up being a little bit smaller in some cases. It kind of just depends, I guess, what the distance is to the shear line. And I find those to be actually pretty easy to pick, because even though the keyway is very restrictive, once you do get in there, you don't have a whole lot of lifting you have to do. So, you know, in a sense, the longer the pins, the more the driver you can have in the core, the better, generally. And I think kind of even with a longer key pin helps as well. Now that said, if it was just a case of putting the longest driver into a lock, you know, you'd find all your keys would simply, you know, be kind of almost zeroed out. because if you have a really long driver sitting in there, that tends to make it more prone to raking, which I'm not a big raker, but man, Lock Lover schooled me in that. I had gone for the most bang for the buck on the drivers, so I had these in a challenge lock, so I had these incredibly long driver pins. But they were happening to sit so far in there that my key pins were very, very tiny, and he just stuck a rake in there and raked it as if it was the key. So yeah, taught me a good lesson on that. So as far, just adding pins to make it unpickable, I mean, someone's going to get into it. I would say you're looking in the ballpark of 6 to 7 is what my guess would be. But your best bet, just make it as high tolerance as you can. I mean, just as precisely fit as you can, and you're probably going to be better off. There are things that people do with these sloppier challenge locks to try to make up for some of the sloppiness. So you do get a lot of serrations, you get a lot of undercutting and things like that. And it does make it more difficult, but again, if you're just thinking of it from a general lock perspective, all those cuts and all those serrations and threading that get done through the Bible and the core, especially if they're paired up with serrated pins, make the pins more likely to stick a lot of times. So you will find that even though, you may have, dig this guy out since he's serrated, that even though you have the driver maybe like that, he may be hung up almost at the shear line. Maybe the shear line's right there and he's just hung up because he's stuck on all the threading. Or likewise, he's down in the core and he's hung up. And again, that's going to make the key potentially a lot stickier and things like that. So from a commercial aspect, not quite as ideal. So yeah, I think, 6 to 7 pins, if I had to design one, maybe 6 to me is kind of a good sweet spot where the lock doesn't get too big. But again, if you're looking to just extend the lock to make it not accommodate the tools that we use, then that's going to eliminate a large number of pickers, and you're going to basically get down to the number. That's going to bust you down to the number of pickers who are going to be making their own tools, which is significantly less. And then the more custom those tools have to be, of course, you're going to weed out even more people being able to pick it. Yeah, so I don't know. Hopefully that sort of answers your question. I mean, you're kind of chasing after the holy grail, right, of what every lock company has always tried to do, is make a lock that can't really be picked. And you can do that by trying to break away from the tools that are being used. You can throw gimmicks in. I kind of hate to call the Everest a gimmick lock, but let's face it, that check pin on the side is not doing a whole heck of a lot for it. And the other thing you can do is just go, stupid complicated, with something like this 3KS, where you're running slider bars and stuff in there. And it works great. It works very, very smooth. But what they've done is they have cut down the number of people that are going to be picking it just by sheer fact of getting away from a lot of the tools, using sliders and stuff. It's hard to get in there and see and work and get to the sliders. I have not picked this yet, so I'm not really in a huge position to talk about the 3KS. But so that's a whole different direction to go. But I would generally say this is a little bit more of a gimmick, just because it has a hidden pin, just like if you did a pin in the back, an engagement lock of some sort, over something like this. This is just legit straight, a good lock. I wouldn't call this a gimmick by any means. This is, a little bit different of a ballpark. It's just once you know how to deal with something on that, you can just deal with it every single time without a problem. But it's still a better tolerance lock, so it's still more difficult than their standards. Anyway, yeah, so I hope that helps you a tiny bit, feel free to message me or leave me a comment if there's something more you are curious about. Maybe we'll get some good comments going in down below too anyway from other people and their opinions. And yeah, we can come back and retouch on this if you want. All right, have a good one.